That's like the whole population of Virginia. Yeah, minus one. And another comparison is Arkansas had two ethnic groups. We had the haves and the have-nots. And New York, I thought was interesting. 48% of the population of New York, their language at home is other than English. Amazing to me. There are estimates between 200 and 600 different languages spoken in the city. 48% of the population is immigrants. This is just, I might as well be thinking of Siberia or thinking of an island in the Pacific. And even to the point, we have a happy hour on second floor, and we have some New York natives, and they'll get to telling stories. I'll have to go home and get my atlas just to see where they're from. So there's a big disparity for part of us. Some of you all know New York. You know it well. You maybe went to school there. You get a chance perhaps to go to some of the cultural events in New York. Well, I'm going to tell you today we've got the real deal in that Susan Tobiasen has spent before coming to Brandon Oaks, she spent over 40 years in the city. So it was irresistible for me as a facilitator for reflections not to get that kind of information spread around to others who needed to learn about a foreign country. So I'm anxious to hear from Susan some of her personal and professional reflections of her life and some life in New York. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Okay. This is me, a child of the 50s, and the first of three daughters born to Lorna and Charles Califf. Almost from the moment of my birth, the doctor knew there was something wrong. My head was too large for my size. My responses in early tests weren't quite normal, and there was a large growth of unknown origin on the back of my neck. With my father's consent, and that's only because my mother was still under anesthesia, I was transferred from my suburban home. Actually, yeah. The hospital where I was born was near Salem. And I was transferred to Children's Hospital in Boston for further care. So a little bit of an ambulance ride in my first hours of birth. I had my first surgery at 6 days old to remove the neck growth. The doctors gave a name to my problem, hydrocephalus, in layman's terms, water on the brain, and told my parents that I'd most likely suffered brain damage from this growth, that they should leave me in the hospital and try again to have a healthy baby. Instead, my parents decided to proceed with the surgery, take me home. They loved me and saw me through 2 more surgeries at about 1 year and 15 months. In those surgeries, doctors inserted a tube and valve system in the back of my head called the shunt system. And it was designed to move the fluid away from my brain down to the rest of my body. I went home and went through many tests in my early years to determine my abilities and my potential for independence. By the time I was 3, okay, my parents knew that my main deficits would be with my motor skills and my physical development. And that's that's my younger sister, Nancy. I was 3, and Nancy was probably about 1 there. Next slide. That's me leading the pack, with Nancy following behind. And still, I enjoyed many of the same things that children should enjoy, like birthday parties. I think it's my 3rd or 4th birthday. Next slide. Next. Trip to Santa. I think I was about 5 there. And 20. And that's a fishing trip. I think I'm probably about 7 there. And that's my sister Nancy, who would be about 7. I was 7, Nancy was 4. And Deborah, who most of you know is the director of the Brandon Bells, she was probably about 2 there.
Which was Deborah?
Deborah's on the left. Okay. we were proud of those fish. I was allowed to attend school with other neighborhood children at age 5. Though my motor skills did lag behind other children, and I really didn't enjoy playground games very much. But I liked to read, and I loved music. Next slide. By 4th grade, by 4th grade, I was singing in school and church choir and taking clarinet lessons, which also greatly improved my finger dexterity, which was a big issue for me. Later, I would switch from clarinet to guitar so that I could sing while I played. Upon finishing high school, it was expected that I would go on to college. I applied to several New England schools and was accepted at Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut. I selected Connecticut College in part because of its study away programs. I'd been a good French student in high school and saw a French major and a year in France as part of my life plan. However, in college, I became less interested in French literature, and which was required for the major, and more interested in trying to solve some of the world's problems. In other words, looking towards a major in either sociology or psychology. So I decided that I would test my interest by applying to study away my junior year, not in France, but in a major American city. I applied to several such programs and decided to attend New York University's junior year in New York program. And you'll see the Empire State Building and New York spread out there. I loved New York. It's Statue of Liberty. So it's downtown Manhattan. I loved meeting people from many different backgrounds and cultures. I loved experiencing different foods and entertainment just steps from my door, or a quick bus or subway ride away. At New York University, I participated in a project interviewing members of senior citizen centers about their healthcare needs. That was used to get funding eventually for a project to bring better health care to seniors on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I returned to Connecticut to finish my bachelor's degree. Oh, this is more of New York. There, okay. I returned to Connecticut to finish my bachelor's degree in sociology. I then went back to Massachusetts, but unable to find a job in social worker counseling, I took a job with a local marketing company. I also found a volunteer job in a nursing home, hoping that it would give me more social work skills for a future job search. In the meantime, I contacted a college friend who held similar aspirations about moving to the Big Apple. In the fall of 1979, I was accepted to New York University to begin my master's degree in social work. Unfortunately, during our weekends of apartment hunting together, the relationship between my friend and I fell apart. So I settled into a cute studio apartment on my own in the upper tip of Manhattan. I only stayed one semester at New York University. I was frustrated by frequent field place changes, which affected my classroom work. New York and I agreed to part company, and at their suggestion, I looked for any job remotely connected to my field to get experience, as opposed to going to another graduate school. After a few months, I landed a job as the Teresa Wacko at a senior citizen center in Brooklyn, planning activities, arts and crafts, education programs, day trips, and weekends away. And that's a map of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and back of me. That's the community in Brooklyn where I was working. During that time, I also started seeing Arthur Tobiasen, who I met at a folk music concert. He was a good resource for me for fun things to do in New York City. Like baseball games, New York Mets. And this is us on I believe it was a Circle Line tour that is one of the sightseeing boats that goes for 3 hours around Manhattan. Some of them include a meal. Some of them it's just a nice boat ride to look at the sights. Arthur was very patient as I decided what I was going to do with my life. With emotional support from Arthur and my family, I decided to leave the Senior Citizen Center after 3 years and try graduate school again, this time at Fordham University, Graduate School of Social Work. I was more successful there than I'd been at New York University, doing well in both classroom and field work. Besides counseling with besides continuing work with older persons, I also gained hospital experience at a Manhattan orthopedic hospital. After graduation, the yellow stole means that I gained my master's degree in social work. After graduation, I quickly landed a job making home visits to at-risk elderly in the Bronx. Once I felt secure in my position there, Arthur and I began to plan a future together. And we were married on September 27, 1986, and moved into my apartment. I eventually moved from doing home visits to a small community hospital that was 10 minutes from my home. So that was a big plus, that I didn't have to be going on the subways and buses all day. This still involved individual counseling, but many of my patients were now younger adults. I loved working and living in the same neighborhood, which proved to be much easier on my mind and body. It also gave Art and I time to pursue music and sports interests, and for me personally to have more time for needlework projects. That is my owl that I have hanging in my kitchen right now. That is Arthur and I at a bluegrass music festival. And we are stars of the Grand Ole Opry, if only for a few minutes. I stayed 26 years at the hospital. Art, meanwhile, left the Housing Authority for a job as an administrative assistant for an oral surgeon. This allowed him to take a more active role in his mother's care in her later years. And also, he was of enormous help to me as I went into shunt failure. You remember my earlier comments about my hydrocephalus. And I ended up in a clinical trial at that time for a programmable valve. This might be of interest, especially to those of you who have pacemakers, that this valve I have in my brain works on a lot of the same principles as a pacemaker in terms of being able to reprogram it if I'm symptomatic. So that, if I'm falling, if I'm, having problems with my balance, then I go to my doctor. He takes out his little computer in a suitcase, as I call it, and sticks a donut-shaped magnet thing on my head, punches a few buttons. I'm reprogrammed and hopefully walking more normally and back to living a more normal life. In spite of the challenges of city living, I feel like my husband and I had a long honeymoon living in New York. By 2016, we were both fully retired and hoped to enjoy more travel. Instead, 2017 proved to be a tough year and a real test of our love. I was diagnosed with colon cancer, requiring surgery and chemotherapy. As hard as it was for him, Art came to all of my chemotherapy treatments, keeping me supplied with folk and bluegrass music while I was on the machines. A couple of years later, Arthur's diabetes worsened, and his frequent hospitalizations coincided with the beginning of the pandemic. And because of the visiting restrictions, I felt guilty that I couldn't offer him more in-person support that might have made him feel better. My dear husband died of complications from diabetes and COVID on December 22nd, 2020. Now I'm in Roanoke. I've always been close to my sisters, and when I seemed very depressed and not getting back to myself after my husband's death, they suggested that it might be time to try something new. Art and I had talked about Brandon Oaks when we were healthier, at the suggestion of my sister, Deborah, who thought that this might be a good move for us. And we even came to visit Brandon Oaks on our own, I guess about 2 years before Arthur died. A lifelong New Yorker, Arthur didn't think he could adapt to being here in Roanoke. So we ended up staying in New York. I'm glad I took the leap of faith to come here eventually. I enjoy the bells and singing in choir at Raleigh Court Methodist Church. I like the puzzle table, and one of the first things that grabbed my attention when I came and took a tour. I can say with reasonable certainty that I'm looking to my future here in my new home. And I would like to close with a couple of images from New York. This is actually 70 Park Terrace East, where I was living. if any of you have been to New York, usually most people, when they think of New York, they think of the Empire State Building, they think of Rockefeller Center, they think of the middle of New York. I happened to get an apartment on the very edge of Manhattan, which for me really made New York very livable. It was more like being in a small town. And my building was right there, a 6-story building, and that's another view of it. Is that it, Buster? Okay. So that's my story. I love being here. I can say that, New York for me at that time was a great place to live. I certainly recommend everybody coming to visit it, especially if you like culture, if you like the arts, if you're a celebrity watcher and you hang out on Broadway, you're probably going to see some big name coming out of a theater. I've seen Joan Rivers, I saw Jackie Mason, I saw Matthew Broderick and what's her name, Sarah Jessica Parker. So it's a great place to people watch. Great restaurants, though I have to say that a lot of them did shut down during the pandemic. So that was a big loss for us, I think, in New York, that so many things did have to shut down. And slowly they're coming back. Well, probably when I first came here, I was writing a lot to my a couple friends from the community chorus that I sang with. I haven't talked to them so much recently, but the people who I do speak with quite often, oddly enough, are my husband's 2 best friends. Who I will also say one of the hardest things about being in New York during the pandemic was planning my husband's funeral, because I was only allowed 5 people for his funeral, and I ended up and that was including myself and the celebrant, the minister who did the funeral. So I chose his 2 best friends, who I still keep in touch with, and my sister Deborah came. But I speak with Mark and Ed, his 2 best friends, probably, I would say every 2 to 3 months. We're all sports junkies, so we talk about how are the Mets doing, how are the hockey teams doing. Any other questions? Oh.
No, I actually have a comment. I immediately became fascinated that you went to New York City and were introduced to bluegrass music.
That was largely thanks to Arthur. My husband was not a singer or a musician himself, but he loved music, and especially music that was a little off the beaten path. I think he actually got into country and bluegrass through his father, when his father was in the service. So we even had bluegrass music at our wedding. We got a local bluegrass group to play our reception. It was wonderful.
You were in social work as a career, and with with the broad ethnicity of New York, was it difficult to relate to the different ethnic backgrounds?
Well, in terms of relating to different ethnic backgrounds, we always have to remain objective as social workers. In terms of communicating, I did learn a little Spanish in my neck of the woods. That was the predominant language, so I did have to learn a little bit of Spanish, and we also had in the hospital what was called an interpreter corps. So we had volunteers who came in and spoke fluently a lot of the languages that were part of New York, and we also used a telephonic interpreter service if we had something that was really offbeat and that we just couldn't provide. Like, I think I had to get a Nordic translator once. I did that telephonically, and I think somebody from was one of the remote islands in the South Pacific. I had to get an interpreter for that once. In terms of, and you do, one of the things I did as a social worker when I did have somebody from a different culture, it was just to get them to talk about that. And what made that important to them so that we could then plan for whatever was to come, whether we had to get a homemaker for somebody who might understand their culture better, or whether it was finding an alternate care facility for them. We usually then would try to find something that would have some staff or some residents or patients that spoke the language and with whom they could communicate. I was not. I that was one thing I never experienced as a social worker is work with children. I always worked with the adult population. In the back? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Transportation, did you drive?
That's it. That's an interesting. Okay, that's an interesting story. When I first moved to New York, I said, I don't know how anybody can drive around here. I was committed to using mass transportation. When I looked at apartments, I wanted to make sure it was something on enough bus and subway lines that I could get around. And then, I met my husband, and we started to develop a lot of interests that were going to involve some travel outside the city. We, as I mentioned in my presentation, we were folk and bluegrass music fans. You didn't find that a whole lot right in the center of the city. We had to go out to suburbs, sometimes to rural locations to find that. And at some point, I guess it was maybe like the mid-90s, I think, I happened to inherit some money from a grandparent who had died. And my grandmother wanted to make sure that when we inherited this money, that we used it for something fun. She said she didn't want to hear from her grave that we had used it to pay for the rent or telephone bills. So my husband and I put the money towards a car. We decided, okay, we're not going to drive. We're probably not going to drive it that much. My husband wasn't a driver at all, and I got my driving skills back in Massachusetts. But, it'll get us out of the city occasionally. We can use it to get out to some of these folk and bluegrass festivals that we've been wanting to attend. And, so that's how we got around driving in New York. I got a few tickets. But so it was, and it was, but you know, as I got more experience driving in New York, like you learned where to park. Like on Sundays, if I was driving to church, it was, you know, I knew where around my church I could safely park, and it was, the parking was free on Sundays, which was great. We did. We had that, and that's why I kept my car in a garage for most of that time. We found an inexpensive garage in our neighborhood, and they were lovely to me. They even did a couple of car repairs for me on the cheap. Anyone else?
How did Buster get away with playing Frank Sinatra at the beginning of your talk?
Yeah, I told them that Frank is from New Jersey. My preference would have been Tony Bennett, but I guess we couldn't find a recording.
All I could find was Tony Bennett was on San Francisco.
Well, that's it. Yeah, Tony. Unfortunately, I love Tony Bennett. Tony is from Astoria, Queens, where my mother-in-law was raised, but he only sang about San Francisco. Anyone else?
I have a whole different perspective of New York City after listening to Susan and visiting with her. And all this time, I'm kind of like you all. I've found out I'm not too old to learn something new. Thank you for being with us today, Reflections. Look forward to seeing you at the next one, okay? Thanks, Susan.